The green M&M. Society's chocolatey sex symbol. Icon of women's suffrage. When you think of Great Venice, you think of Cleopatra, one of the first female heads of states. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female doctor. Coco Chanel, deconstructor of societally portrayed women's attire. Overall, above everything, one green girl in some rockin' go-go boots stands above them all. Wait, they took away her go-go boots?
They made the green M&M less sexy.
They de-bimbolified the green M&M?
This demands public outrage. Tax our tea and we'll pour it into the harbor. Remove the boots from our candy and we'll do something outrageous, okay?
This is the most disappointed I've ever been since I called my first grade teacher Dad.
One time I was too shy to get off the bus and I rode to the very end and it took an hour to get home.
Oh my god, that's harsh.
You should talk about this on your podcast.
Junk drawer? Yeah, we should.
You do know this was a cover-up for a child slavery lawsuit, right? Wait, what the f- Hey, my name is Turb, and in the month of January, social media went through a panic. Was it Wordle? Worse. Was it the propaganda-induced Ghost of Kiev defending Ukraine on what looks to be the start of World War III? Less Eurocentric. Is it because Biden's launching his they-them army on Russia? I said it was less Eurocentric. Could it be the cocoa industry's exploitation of Africa? Now make it a musical. William, heavens God, good morning, good sir. We have a little colonization problem in Africa. What is it? You see, remember the Ivory Coast population that we enslaved in the plantations? Oh God, how could I forget? I'm still profiting to this day. You see, it turns out that wasn't all that it was cut out to be. While we were sipping tea and putting minorities in slavery, the social climate deteriorated dramatically. And now we're in the midst of a worldwide catastrophe. God, Richard, that sounds terrible. But do not fret, good lad. On God. For I know how to expel this situation. Take the boots off the M&M. Put her sluttiness in probation. Please adhere to my cadence, nigga, patience. While the public is in uproar, we'll go on vacation. You're so smart, Richard. You're such a clever lad, Richard. Good show. Let's cut to the chase. The green M&M is de-bimbofied. The public is upset, and upset they should be. Taking down and deconstructing the queen of sex appeal is an outrage. Her societal impact on beauty constructs knows no bounds. Realistically, if we were to equate this to a human personification, the green M&M is our generation's Mona Lisa. I mean, look at her. She tops Rihanna, SZA, Zendaya, but not my beautiful Patreon supporters who I love. Link in bio. Then boom, you look behind the scenes. You peel open the blinds and the sweet white nectar of truth beams down on you. It's all a lie. Untruth. Not correct. It's a cover-up for slavery. Yeah, the cocoa industry literally covered up a child slavery lawsuit by creating a meme. Welcome to 2020, where a chocolate circle and green boots matters more than an African slave laborer. The way companies PR nowadays to save face is such a bizarre concept to me. Because if PR teams existed throughout history, I mean, Jesus would be white. Columbus would have founded America. South America's collapse would be blamed on socialism and not on American coup d'etats. Thank God that history is not construed to make the victors seem morally favorable. God bless America, home of the indigenous, home of the white and proud, baby. Fly them Confederate stripes. Anyways, there's injustice going on here. Chocolate flavored, hideous, non-lingerie wearing injustice. Today specifically, we'll be deep diving into the cocoa industry's exploitation of Africa. I'm going to be going through this video in a series of 3 acts. The first act will entail a history of the most cocoa-enriched place in the world, the Ivory Coast. In fact, it produces 38% of the world's cocoa supply. Yeah, the world. You know when you emptied out your big ass trash bag when you were 13 years old trick-or-treating? Probably 1/3 of that chocolate was picked by an exploited African child. Can you imagine that? It's important to know the history of exploitation that went on in these countries to even begin to fathom the scale of exploitation that these companies partake in. The second act will consist of the history regarding these cocoa industries, actions against them, an overview of company policies, and settlements which allow them to exist as a corporate conglomerate. The third act will just be me beating the shit out of Willy Wonka because his chocolatey reign has gone on for way too long. Nah, I'm kidding. At least Willy Wonka had empathy for the kids. The third act will be an overview of the horrific accusations against these chocolate companies. So without further ado, this is my flamingo remote, by the way. He's a little different. He likes to quack for some reason. But it's okay, because we accept differences over here, right, Flamingo? Let's dive into this video, shall we? Act 1. The Ivory Coast is the world's largest cocoa producing country. In fact, the whole of Western Africa in itself produces 2/3 of the world's cocoa crop. At first, you may consider, Africa brings in a lot of money from its cocoa industry. Good for them. But we live in a capitalistic world where companies reap profit off of exploitative outsourcing. The cocoa industry is valued at but pays its workers only $1 a day for the intense labor done under the scorching sun. And on top of that, they also ingest pesticides used to fertilize crops, which shorten these people's lifespans by the second. Like taking candy from a baby, more like taking chocolate from a conglomerate of exploited minorities legally backed by the oppressive system of capitalism. Exploitation on this scale is something that we in the Western world have the luxury of not experiencing. So to become familiar with the malpractices and conniving businesses of the cocoa industry, we have to get acquainted with the oppressive atmosphere which led to the situation at hand. We're going to be diving into the history of the most affected country suffering under the cocoa industry's nigh totalitarian rule in order to portray how oppressive influences and a dark traumatic history has led to chocolatey exploitation. The Ivory Coast, if you didn't know, which I don't know how you don't know because I said it a million times, is in Africa, specifically West Africa. But Ivory, like most African countries, juxtaposed to its beautiful name, is tormented by a historical looming shadow of dread. Now, we don't know exactly how far back original settlement was made by native inhabitants, as the area has a very humid climate, meaning human remains don't tend to preserve well. Archaeologists, therefore, can't really dig up something that's not there. It's important to note that the Ivory Coast was also never the Ivory Coast. The Mayo marauders, French people, actually forcefully made the people of this region adopt this name via erasure of their historical culture. Prior to vanilla villain colonization, there were 5 important states making up the Ivory Coast. These included the Muslim Kong Empire in the north-central region, the Abron Kingdom, the Bole Kingdom, and the 2 Agni Kingdoms. They all had unique differing diplomatic connections to one another, all with their own individual identity and cultures, meaning sometimes they didn't exactly get along in all regards, which is important to note because under the French, they'd all be subjugated as one people. Imagine combining the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Damn, that's a lot of snowflakes in one image. I think they call this an avalanche. Anyways, this is obviously just setting up a recipe for disaster. The British would be slapping the French with tea, the French would be forcefully deep-throating Germans with baguettes, Germany would, you know what they do historically. We don't talk about Germany in Kanto style. Nevertheless, the point is, when you combine a region with differing cultures, customs, languages, and identities forcefully, you're just creating a recipe for disaster. Ingrained vendettas and hatred will take over and ultimately lead to political collapse, which is what happened in Africa. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the Frenchy-wenchy toilet seat henchies arrived there was a conglomerate of dynasties in the Ivory Coast region. Europeans didn't exactly make a beeline for the Ivory Coast though. In fact, their trade lines were more ingrained in modern-day Nigeria and Ghana. It was only around the 1600s that the Bleached Brigade, specifically the French, Portuguese, and the British, established outposts on the coast of Ivory under the protection of African rulers, who welcomed them for the goods and economic services that they provided. More specifically though, these white termites traded for goods such as pepper, gold, ivory, and later during the rise of the American colonies, slaves. Wasn't slavery already happening in Africa? Aight, Clarence, for this one you gotta pipe down, cause no way in HELL are you comparing the Atlantic slave trade to Africa's. Let me give you a little history lesson. The slave trade outside of Africa, enforced by European powers, is distinguished by 3 main aspects: its magnitude, the duration of its effects, and the violence that accompanied this form of slavery. Historians estimate that 30 million Africans were deported from different parts of Africa and enslaved in other regions of the world. To put this into context, this is comparable to everyone from the state of New York and Washington combined, just up and disappearing. If we count the number of those who died during the capturing process, on the boats towards various ports, in the holding camps, and in the Middle Passage, there were in fact hundreds of millions of lives that were taken from Africa. That's the equivalent to California, New York, and Canada just disappearing. Furthermore, this version of slavery was an attack on African identity. To justify Africans as slaves, Europeans scientifically tried to degrade black people as lower forms of human beings, combining all African people under the term black and applying derogatory connotations to the word. These Caucasian crustaceans also went out of their way to erase black history in an attempt to rewrite black people out of existence through a series of perceivably scientific discourses. And to top it all off, they also denied rights and citizenship through all types of policies, laws, and strategies of discrimination. Yes, old world slavery is bad, but not even feasibly touching, not even close, not even in the same building. In fact, not even in the same universe as the atrocities surrounding the Atlantic slave trade. Comparing these two forms of slavery is like comparing a singular murder to the Holocaust. So please educate yourself, Clarence. Anyways, the French then established its first foothold in Western Africa through an area in modern-day Ghana called Assinai. After establishing this colony, they acted like the true imperialistic bastards that they are. Vying for profit, they acted to spread their influence beyond the borders of Assinai. Fast forward to the 1840s. The Wee Ooglees then sought out trade routes on the coast of Ivory, signing trade agreements to ensure safety and good faith. And then came the scramble for Africa in 1885, when European countries split apart the continent quicker than Girl Scouts selling batches of cookies. It took them around 30 years, and excluding family members, I think it would take a Girl Scout around 30 years to meet her quota. Oh, and if you didn't know, the scramble of Africa took place in 1885, when a bunch of European leaders sat around a rudimentary disfigured map in black and white. It's in black and white because no one had color at that time, silly. Color was made in the 1970s. See, this is before, this is after. Yeah, before that, life was just a silent film. Anyways, these leaders all grabbed pens or quills, I guess, and just started carving out pieces for themselves, like giving a bunch of kids steak knives at a 4-year-old's birthday party. You think those kids have any regard for that cake? No, they're too busy trying to take the frothiest piece with the most whipped cream. Similar to 4-year-old toddlers, it seems like those Europeans' thoughts were lacking something called basic human decency. The vanilla villains didn't care about the good of the people that they were subjecting. They were too busy trying to play a game of Monopoly with the lives of African people. Oui, mademoiselle, the place is mine. The place is mine. The place is mine. I like to think this interaction took place similarly to the seagull scene from Finding Nemo, to counteract how diabolical these pasty phantoms really were. Basically, when all was said and done, all you had was a collection of city-states that more often than not had a history including violence. It's like squishing together the 4 junior high schools that don't like each other into one. In essence, Africa just became a high school. The principal was a monarch who, instead of giving detentions to students who showed skin, gave detentions based on the color of it. By the way, the detentions in this school just mean they dismember your hand and collect it. Shout out King Leopold, biggest bastard in human existence. And the popular white girls who were buddy-buddy with the principal were the merchants, and similarly they enforced a social hierarchy. But that social hierarchy was slavery. Unlike Europe, Africa at this time didn't have masses of countries with nationalistic ideals and militaristic significance. To make matters worse, there was no Black Panther. Yeah, there was no nationalistic symbol for all Africans to flock to and heroicize and consume, as that was a bit. Africa in itself was now a subject to exploitation. The whole continent and all of its people dehumanized. Europe's only goal was to make it financially fair between the countries taking place in the exploitation of Africa. And African people were seen as a product, a dollar sign, with their well-beings not even being considered. With economic gain in mind, these pasty patrons split up African land due to resources and ease of access concerning major rivers. But in this way, these countries were divided and set up for failure. And when I say failure, I mean the Rwandan genocide, where 800,000 people ultimately died. The Sudanese civil war, where almost 400,000 people died. South African's apartheid, which societally separated white and African people. Ultimately, all these events' root causes were colonialism. Europe messed up royally. You could literally make the argument that a 9-year-old man with nothing but Parkinson's, a blindfold, and a pen at his disposal could create more societally stable countries. The scramble for Africa is probably the biggest world event to shape modern history, and I mean that. Yet schools subject it to a measly 3 pages because it pits white people as the villains, which they are. Its historical influence has more of an impact than World War I or World War II. And that's not even a hot take, you've just been miseducated. Without the scramble for Africa and all the slaves it brought into the Americas, America in itself wouldn't have the financial means to be a superpower in the modern day. Germany's personal vendetta against the rest of Europe for being left out of the scramble of Africa possibly wouldn't have overboiled against the rest of Europe, which means there might have been no World War I, and then consequently there would be no World War II. But even if Germany still decided to take take the nationalistic approach, World War I would have fared very differently, as Britain, Belgium, France, and most European countries wouldn't be major superpowers. Europe wouldn't have even been a tenth of as prosperous as it's been in the modern day. It's estimated that trillions of dollars were stripped from Africa, and even then there's still $39 billion being taken from Africa each year. By the way, that was a time stoppage. I just want to say throughout this video I'll be having two types of hair. I recorded these videos on 2 separate weeks, and on the second week I just decided to go out and dye my hair pink. So you'll have to suffer through the green-pink transition for me, okay? I'm like Cosmo and Wanda, baby. All in one. And you are Timmy Turner. Your wish is this video, so you better keep watching. Cut back, this isn't even to account for the 1.8 million lives lost in the Middle Passage, and the millions of lives lost in the Civil War and conflicts due to the imbalance colonialism brought in. This amounts to an unfathomable amount of potential lives that were lost directly induced by colonial practices. These lives include the genocides of groups like the Tutsi in Rwanda and the Darfur people in Sudan. During this time period of colonial Africa, large swaths of land masses were divided by only 7 European countries. These land masses created by the Europeans are the African countries that we see today. They matured, grew, and developed into their own countries under the oppressive rule of the Mayo minions. But maybe matured isn't the best word to use in this particular instance, because countries only became countries through battling against European regimes, utilizing political ventriloquism in order to run their said colonies. Like evil Robbie from Victorious. Why did I just use a Victorious simile like that? This is brought to you by 1800s African imperialism. It's like 2000s African imperialism, except British instead of American. Sadly, in regards to the Ivory Coast, the Brigetti Brigade, the French, were forcefully instated as the Caucasian colonial occupiers, who took their life, liberty, freedom, and rights, all for the sake of chocolate. Resistance to the French was evident. The Ivory Coast population didn't really fare well with being treated like animals and clumped into a combined country forcefully. They then began to act in a series of guerrilla warfare tactics against the French, who only in 1917 managed to defeat the resistance. After savagely mowing down the opposition of the soon-to-be Ivory Coast inhabitants and getting rid of any sentiment against its rule, the French concentrated on developing the country's economy, with the main emphasis on the production of raw materials for export. They did this by utilizing the forcibly found country's citizens as slaves, making them build roads, public facilities, and brutally forcing them to work on plantations. It started off with palm oil and timber being the Ivory Coast's most important products, but later in 1905, cocoa was introduced and ultimately became the largest exported item of the 1930s. Wait. So you're telling me that this long convoluted history of the Ivory Coast settlement, being its identity, politics, and people, boils down to cocoa? Yeah. Basically, the French were Charlie, and the chocolate factory was an oppressed settlement off the coast of Africa. However, at this time, the French dabbled in more than just chocolate. They also took gold, ivory, and slaves. But the biggest economic factor in the 1930s was the cocoa industry. Imagine likening a whole group of people to rats, instating societal laws that kill their language and their culture, then separating their kids from their parents, forcing the kids to work in plantations. Also, you can enjoy some peanut-free M&Ms because you're mildly allergic. Like some type of lunatic Halloween, but instead when you encounter the pale men playing dress up, you know, when you knock on their door and you say trick or treat, they give you the trick, and the trick is just slavery. The Ivory Coast finally became a free country in the 1960s. However, it took almost 100 years of struggle against an oppressive regime just to finally enjoy its own democracy. But if you think liberation was a means to an end for this country, then I'm sorry to inform you, but you're wrong. I nailed that shit. Act 2. This was just the imperialistic beginning. The Ivory Coast escaped the French, but they couldn't duck Adam Smith. Remember when I said the Ivory Coast never originally shipped cocoa? Well, they haven't. The seeds sown that destabilized this nation was imported by colonial rule. These same seeds sown, when developed, would contribute to the political turmoil of the Ivory Coast. Almost way too literally metaphoric in that sense. Imperialism made the country cocoa nuts. Okay, I'm done. I swear, I promise. Imperialism corrupted the country. In fact, imperialism corrupted the whole of Africa. European countries did this by dehumanizing African people from the outside, by racially degrading them, and degrading the places they came from as third world countries, painting a picture of poverty while actively being the artists who conjured it. In this way, European countries utilize social conditioning. Social conditioning is the sociological progress of training individuals in a society to respond in a manner generally approved by the society in general, and peer groups within society. By subjecting African individuals to years and years of oppression, this same oppression was ultimately, sadly, accepted. It was that or be punished. European countries throughout the years managed to marinate unfair practices as socially acceptable throughout the years, both within Africa and outside of it. By outside of it, I mean, to be realistic, no one cares about Africa's struggles with overseas companies. This essentially means imperialism's influence never really went away. The only difference was, instead of governments running colonial states, companies became the said rulers. You know why it's called capitalism? Because this practice exists to capitalize off decades of white supremacist slave labor. Someone got to trademark that. I kind of snapped. The Ivory Coast economy is agriculturally based. Where you see a plant, they see money. They literally grow money. From cocoa, copra, pineapples, rubber, palm oil, coffee, wood, cotton, and various fruits are farmed in the Ivory Coast, then sold in the market both domestically and abroad. As the performative white woman would say, can you do the honors, flamingo? We stand an exploited queen. I love that guy. That guy's so cool, man. He's better. He's chilling. The small country of the Ivory Coast has been faced with exploitation since conception. In fact, the Ivory Coast historical exploitation still rages on to the modern day. I mean, it's not Ukraine or an old Gothic building conjured up by ruthless tyrants. So why should we fund it, right? There's cottagecore in Ukraine, but there's no cottagecore in the Ivory Coast. So why should we care, right? White supremacy still lives on. The Ivory Coast is economically eclipsed by superpowers that continue to sap its resources. So it's by no means a surprise that the Ivory Coast is also without worldwide political power. Because of these key factors, the Ivory Coast fell to the malicious tactics of international business. You see, in the Western world, we have all kinds of rules and laws to protect our workers. Well, if you call $15 a livable wage, I guess. We have the good fortune of having lobbyists, a rich economic history fueled by white supremacy, and laws that work in favor of our laborers. Till you want enough money to go to school or buy a house and live comfortably. Then you're on your own, bud. However, exploited countries like the Ivory Coast, in comparison to the West, have almost no checks and balances for overseas companies. To put this into perspective, the minimum salary in the Ivory Coast is 129,000 CFA. That's a big number, hey. 100,000? In COVID times, I would kill for 6 figures in my bank account. I got like 2. I'm not lying. Please support my Patreon. Please make that 2 figures into maybe a 3. That'd be cool. Anyways, that might sound like a lot of money, but when you convert the price of 129,000 CFA into US dollars, you can find that the salary turns into 214 US dollars a month, which is roughly $7 a day. I'm pretty sure the suburban white kid makes more money selling strawberry lemonades to dads that trim their shrubs in intricate shapes than these exploited African workers do. The Ivory Coast, being resource rich, unstable, and less worker friendly, checks out all the criteria for businesses looking to seek a profit. And of course, the most heinous examples of international entrepreneurial exploitation is the Ivory Coast chocolate industry. Corruption and imbalances of power have gotten so out of hand that offshore companies literally went to war over ownership of Ivory Coast chocolate. Yes, war, where thousands of lives have been taken for the sake of securing the economic rights to cocoa plantations. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Go back, further back, like Little John at a frat party. To the windows, to the wall, to 1960. That sounded a lot cooler on script. In the 1960s, the Ivory Coast was experiencing an economic boom unlike the likes of anything seen before. Their exports literally accounted for 40% of their gross domestic product. Between 1960 and 1981, their exports literally accounted for 40% of their total gross domestic product. They were pushing P. They were pushing P out those ports. Pushing P means pushing products, so that applies here, which means 40% of the goods and service that the country made a profit from was coming directly from exports like cocoa. For instance, have you ever played one of those cafe games or any kind of Roblox mini clip or cool math ripoff? Basically, this is the equivalent of all your customers coming in and ordering an espresso, which I don't know why you would drink. It's bitter and it hits like crack in the 90s. However, in the Ivory Coast situation, everyone in the world was developing a taste for chocolate, and the Ivory Coast, being the most cocoa-enriched place in the world, was flexing like a 2016 SoundCloud rapper. Their money was coming in and their economy was skyrocketing. It went like phew, phew, stonks. However, the Ivory Coast government took a percentage of this money through a practice called rents. These rents were deductions meant to bolster the economy. Since these deductions were dependent on how much the agricultural sector was making, the Ivory Coast president at this time promoted this sector by inviting cheap labor from abroad to work on cocoa holding. This policy came to be known as the I can't read that, it's too French for me. Editor, please take over.
Houphouët Boigny policy. Oh, that was so bad.
Which was also the president's name at the time. I think the president was trying to cement his legacy by slapping his name on a societally changing policy, which I get because I'd totally slap my name onto the lynching of billionaires if it was a thing. But this aged terribly, like the opposite of wine. I don't want to say milk because that's kind of played out. But I mean, yeah, if life was a diving contest, he did cement his legacy by encasing himself in the said cement and then diving into the Marianas Trench. And then in a futile attempt to swim back to shore, he drowned about 3,000 feet under. Anyways, I'm just gonna call this the Hugh Compromise. The Hugh Compromise guaranteed that land would quote-unquote belong to those who make it produce, on a you work it, you own it type beat, which opened the possibility of land ownership for non-citizens. Immigrants eager to start a new life would look at this policy like a gold mine, as would anyone. This policy was almost too good to be true. Immigrants both benefited from owning the land while simultaneously reaping the rewards of their labor, thus drawn by the prospect of having their own fertile lands to work with someday. Hundreds and thousands of migrant workers streamed across the country's northern borders in order to take advantage of this opportunity. The result of this was, by 1981, almost all wage laborers on smallholder farms were immigrants. Over 1 million people had come in from Upper Volta, now currently known as Burkina Faso, which is a country in Western Africa, and 500,000 people had come in to work from Mali. The Ivory Coast region was struggling with a cultural identity problem already. They had different ideological differences, cultural differences, differences of ethics. They were just different. You know, try to get a classroom of kids to decide on one ice cream flavor. Some are gonna pick the pink bubblegum ice cream, that circle little ice cream, maybe the Sonic one with the oogly eyes. Now apply that metaphor to the Ivory Coast government, but instead of ice cream, it's the economy, social setting, and everything that they know and love. Basically, what you get is political turmoil. What I'm saying is there were major unforeseen consequences that would ultimately cripple the cocoa rents that the government relied on, whilst building foundations for future conflict. One of these unforeseen consequences regarded the newly imported migrant workers who took advantage of the property ownership policy, the Hugh Compromise, which made ownership for non-citizens a possibility by investing in their own farms when they owned enough money to do so. It's like playing Farmville with a limited amount of land. Herb, did you just compare the political unrest that would disenfranchise millions of people to Farmville? Yes, I did. Welcome to Turb's channel, where we use the most critical of metaphors in order to get a point across. As time went on, economic factors that led to these smaller cocoa farms failing in total production, mainly due to limits on space that could be cultivated. The Ivory Coast was only so big, and more producers meant a decrease in average production per holding. The Hugh property rights policy also encouraged unlimited expansion and exploitation of land by treating it as a cost-free resource. The free-for-all mentality encouraged by the government started a decline in land productivity, a decline in production, and thus a decline in rent subsidies for the government. When you rely on Adam Smith, you ultimately get Adam smitten with greed, corruption, and economic disparities. And the solution to these problems? Work them more. Work them more than they've ever been worked in their life. Failing rent stressed the needs for greater production towards the country's migrant laborers, which then only deepened the downward spiral that they were experiencing. The Hugh Compromise was horrible for the economy, but it did improve the imported workers' welfare and sense of belonging in the Ivory Coast society, but only for the workers, remember that. Most of the Ivory Coast didn't take well to the workers succeeding the way they did. Remember how I said Africa was rigidly formed and tensions among ethnic groups still existed? Well, now there was a whole new ethnic ethnic groups, siphoning money from the economy. And they were doing this better than most of the dominant ethnic groups at the time. And as crops grew scarce, southern ethnic groups began to resent the migrants' successes. In the Lipalul community, I might not be pronouncing that right, which is one of the most powerful ethnic groups in the Ivory Coast. Migrant laborers had taken so much land from their former shareholdings that the Balul had trouble turning a profit. Migrants had so much power at this time that instead of working on elite Balul farms, they worked on their own or other migrants' farms. Having less land reserved for this dominant group also increased pressure on Balul politicians, which I'm probably saying wrong. Another major ethnic group in the Ivory Coast, the Bati, also carried resentment towards these immigrants. The Bati earned their money by leasing fertile land to farmers and cultivators, meaning the Hue Compromise made it impossible for the Bati to turn a fortune, because instead of leasing land, these migrants could just own the land they worked on. Combined with the worldwide decline in cocoa prices in the 1980s, crop rents, which were essentially funding the economy at the time, plummeted. Instead of dealing with tensions between ethnogroups and the Hue policy failure, the Ivory Coast decided to just extract more rent. The work of Adam Smith, smithing the economy with his Smith fists. Capitalism bad. Ultimately, the Hue policy was responsible for economic regression at a time where migrant inflow was feeding into resentment. In 1993, the president ultimately died, which led to politicians capitalizing on the growing resentment and division that politically, socially, and economically engulfed the Ivory Coast. In particular, southern politicians seized on the concept of Ivorite. As we talked about, the Ivory Coast didn't really have a sense of identity. It was a string of ethnogroups forcibly put under colonial rule, and Ivorite was seen as a solution to this problem. Ivorite refers to the common cultural identity of everyone living in the Ivory Coast. And while Ivorite was initially placed to celebrate a common national identity for all Ivorians, the term gradually developed into an exclusionary term. The Ivorite ideology became a xenophobic, exclusionary mindset the dominant South used towards northern Ivorians and migrant groups. Politics based on Ivorite thus also became exclusionary towards northern inhabitants. These inequalities have always been problematic in the Ivory Coast. Northern groups have always been the country's least fortunate peoples. In fact, in surveys conducted between 1994 and 1998, northern ethnic groups had the worst literacy and socioeconomic prosperity statistics in the country. But as the Ivorite ideology developed into an institutionalized form of xenophobia, there was now a newfound ideology which made reaffirming these inequalities socially acceptable. Actually, more than socially acceptable. This form of xenophobia against the North became the social norm. Under the now deceased Hue, I can't say his full name, it's still too French for me, the government had at least maintained a positive presence in the region by investing some of the earnings they made from rents into services and infrastructure in the north. Small W's here and there. However, the newer politicians in government, though, were not as generous. As rents decreased and divisions grew, later governments ended the practice of northern industrialization due to the Hue policy essentially being relinquished with the death of its judicator. Rest in peace, Hue. Which you kind of contributed in imperialism and destabilizing the country. So we have mixed feelings for you. Politicians began deciding to invest only in the southern half of the country, and as a result, the economic gap between the north and the south continued to widen. Slowly, northerners were targeted and mistreated. Already at the bottom of the economic period, they were now being evicted from their land. The concept of Ivorite was also used as an excuse to exclude northern politicians from holding positions of power, which ultimately evolved into war in the 2000s. This is where the West come in. They're like Superman if Superman only cared about white people. The imperialist Caucasian crusaders that only show up when there's a destabilized country that they can economically profit from. They sowed the seeds for demise and now they capitalize on it. They literally gave the Ivory Coast the seeds to their own demise by importing cocoa into their country. Kinda Shakespearean, don't you think? Like Ronald Reagan, but instead of crack, it's cocoa. The main parties conflicted in this chocolate war was the central government of the Ivory Coast, supported by France and the United States. The Young Patriots of the Abidjan militia, backed by Liberian mercenaries and pilots from Belarus. And the forces of, I can't even say that. Translated, the New Forces, supported by Russia, Bulgaria, and Burkina Faso, all looking to secure separate economic interests. More than 3,000 soldiers, militia members, and civilians ended up being killed in this conflict. And while the cocoa industry was literally affecting the power balance between ethnogroups, political powers, and the world's taste buds, it was also destroying the Ivory Coast's forests and national parks. Quote, Activist group Mighty Earth shows more than 30% of Ivory Coast cocoa production is conducted illegally and spread across at least 220 protected forests and national parks. If a farmer wanted to earn more, he or she had to produce more, which would mean using more land. However, since Ivory Coast economic hue policy sailed and failed, the result is there isn't a lot of land to come by. The Ivory Coast is running out of farmland, and because of that, it has to fight to increase farmers' earnings so that they are not tempted to illegally grow cocoa in protected forests. Finally, however, Western media would be forced to fathom the evils of the cocoa industries in a shocking way, when in September 2000, a film was broadcast on Channel 4 television in the UK, showing young Mali men working in conditions of slavery on cocoa farms in the Ivory Coast. There were previous written reports and complaints done by international agencies and non-governmental organizations, which called out practices of child trafficking. However, this was the first time that any film of the issue had been seen. In my honest opinion, crackers don't suffer under the broth of oppression, so for them, seeing is believing. This claim is backed by the immediate call by the public for action from the chocolate industry, which then again was reinforced by a series of further reports around Easter 2001, generating the most publicity for any issue of slavery that Anti-Slavery International has seen. Now riddle me this. What does Willy Wonka have in common with the chocolate industry? Simple. They're both capitalistic pigs that lie about the joy of their work in order to exploit their workers. Now, the Ivory Coast wasn't the only country exploited by the chocolate industry. Countries in the West like Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Liberia also suffered under the Western world's milk chocolatey palms. Pun intended. These countries all suffered under imperialistic reign in differing ways. What they shared though was the economic commodity being targeted, the resource known as cocoa bean. This is what chocolate gets its flavor and texture from. Without cocoa beans, chocolate just can't be made. Chocolate is literally just fermented cocoa beans. Now that we grasp the history of oppression, we can really understand how the chocolate industry was able to exploit African people. But the Ivory Coast is just one example of a political landscape that was tormented by the cocoa bean. I say African people because their victims stretch further than just the Ivory Coast. Western countries like Ghana and Liberia are also exploited for every inch of cocoa Adam Smith can shake out of them. And although Ghana and Liberia have their own convoluted histories, keep in mind that a history of imperialist oppression runs deep in all these countries. Now, in my opinion, actually, in fact, regarding the chocolate industry's practices, all megalith chocolate industries are guilty because they contribute to a culture of slavery in Africa. They are so guilty, the world forced them to acknowledge it, relish it, see well, actually, no, the world doesn't really do much unless the people being exploited are in Europe. But in 2002, the World Cocoa Foundation signed a document which summed up, basically said, we won't participate in child slavery anymore. There are also multiple lawsuits cocoa workers have brought to the world stage in an attempt to gain reparations out of being exploited. The lawsuit we'll be looking at today is one of many swept under the rug. And this was swept under the rug by a PR team. When this lawsuit was pushed, the company Mars decided, hey, this is really bad for our image. We don't want to be tied to slavery and all. How do we go about clearing our public image? Oh, I know. Let's remove the boots off the green M&M. The public will eat that up. God, William, you're a genius. Specifically in this lawsuit, the companies Mars, Nestle, and Hershey are facing a child slavery lawsuit in the US. 8 young African adults who worked on the cocoa plantation on the Ivory Coast in their adolescence have come out and demanded compensation for their labor. These specific 8 people, like thousands of other children, spent their childhood slaving away for chocolate companies in hope of feeding their families with the little money they'd make. Yet they were still not paid. It's sad because all these companies literally had to do in order to evade these lawsuits was pay these kids $30 a month out of the billions of dollars of revenue they make a year. That's less than a drop in the bucket. It's like if you assigned a chef to make a huge cake, okay? 3 stories tall, big as a skyscraper, all because you wanted to lick the spoon. So you spent years and years and years and years just beating the eggs, kneading the flour, and baking the cake. And then after 10 years, you end up looking at that cake and thinking to yourself, damn, this is gonna be the best spoon lick of my life. Then you look to the right, and the chef is licking the spoon. But keep in mind, slavery is like way worse than making a cake, you know? Yeah. Anyways, this is the first time that a class action of this kind has been filed against the cocoa industry in the US court. It's monumental. And on top of that, research done by the US State Department, the International Label Department, and UNICEF allege that these workers' experience with slavery is mirrored by thousands of other minors, meaning these young adults are unlikely to lose. They have tons of evidence at their disposal. A central allegation of the lawsuit is that the defendants, being the companies, knowingly profited from the illegal work of children. And to top top it all off, according to the submissions, the young adults were only hired because they were kids, meaning their bosses profited off of providing lower prices to the kids than if they had employed adult workers with proper protective equipment. They couldn't give the workers $30 and be done with it. No, they wanted to pay the workers even less. So they took impressionable kids and forced them to work for money. Well, actually no money in this case. When the kids asked for the paychecks, they didn't even receive a penny. The lawsuit also accuses the companies, who are all a part of the World Cocoa Foundation, of actively misleading the public by hiding their slave trade from the media. In face, the cocoa company is so aware of its evils its products bring that in 2001 they instated the Harkin-Engel Protocol by promising to phase out some child labor. Keyword is some. Yeah, they were still allowed to use child labor to a reasonable degree. You know, can't erase child labor entirely. This is why we love capitalism. Now, the original deadline for achieving these said standards was 2005. We're now in 2022, almost 20 years later, and we're still on square one. In this legal claim, all 8 victims of child slavery describe being recruited in Mali through trickery and deception, then trafficked across the border to cocoa farms in the Ivory Coast, where they were then forced to work, spanning from 7 years or more, with no pay, no travel documents, and no clear idea of where they were or how to get back to their families. The court papers allege that the victims, all of who were under 16 years old at the time of their recruitment, worked on farms in major cocoa producing areas of the country. One of these victims was only 11 years old when a local man in his hometown promised him work in the Ivory Coast in return for $400 a month. The legal documents allege that the boy worked for 2 years without ever being paid and applying pesticides and herbicides without any protective clothing. Another victim had visible cuts on his hands and arms from machete accidents. Most of the former slaves, also in the court documents, reported being fed very little while working high-paced, long hours. They also claimed they were isolated from other child workers. So the victims' lawyers then set out and scoped out the camps that these former victims were kept in to prove that children were being kept as slaves. What they found were children were using machetes, applying chemicals, and undertaking other hazardous tasks on cocoa plantations that were producing for these companies. One of these companies listed in this case is Mars. Mars owns M&Ms, but they do way more than make chocolate bars. Mars is a multinational manufacturer of pet food and a provider of animal care services, with $40 billion in annual sales in 2020. In fact, it was ranked as the 6th largest privately held company in the United States by Forbes. And in an attempt to escape public scrutiny from this child slavery lawsuit, the Mars PR team met up and had a discussion. The question presented was what scapegoat they could use in order to escape this public scandal. Maybe they could just simply apologize and do better. Maybe they could do it Sienna May style and do a little Dougie and be like, sorry slaves. You know, it's not hard to say sorry. And obviously, concerning all the atrocities we just went over, it's more than needed. It's literally the least you could do. Sure, it's the equivalent of slapping a band-aid on a severed limb, but it's better than nothing, right? Yeah, no. Corporations as they are, in order to keep up their public image, just come up with diversions. And how did they do this? By taking the green M&M's go-go boots. Yes. Welcome to Western media, where the go-go boots of an inanimate sex symbol is more important than the lives of thousands of African children. And the internet ate it up. Fox News reported on it. Twitter was in an uproar, literally causing a trend of memes revolving around the green M&Ms having her boots removed. The Guardian literally wrote an article about it, stating that Mars was slut-shaming the green M&M. If only it were that simple. I mean, I don't fuck with the patriarchy, but an inanimate object being slut-shamed and slavery, it's just not really a good comparison here. There's different ways in each evil, that's all I'm saying. Now, this article is written at this time around a year ago, meaning the case grows further and further away from the spotlight as we go on. And it's looking like the Mars company is gonna dodge this lawsuit altogether. And dog, me and you just went through 40 minutes of this atrocity, okay? Atrocity after atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. I know you're mad, okay? I know you're asking, Turb, what do we do? Well, I'm mad too, and I have a plan. Yes, I, Turb, have a plan. We're gonna get justice for these child slaves while simultaneously condemning the capitalistic practices of the Mars company, okay? Think. How do we get the media? No. How do we get the internet? No. How do we get society on our side? If there's one thing that connects us all, it's music. So this is what I'm vouching. How about we push a viral song to counter the M&M's PR team? Like fighting memes with memes. If we get the superior meme, then our voice will be heard. So if you want to bring justice to the thousands of lives of slaves, channel your anger, listen to this song, send it to your friends, post it on your stories, and let's make the Mars Company pay. Cue the track, DJ.
Hey.
Yeah, Terry.
A little less yeet type beat and a little more Eurocentric, like Beethoven.
All right, Turb. I'm sorry. I was just trying to cater to like your skin color, you know, because you're like black. And
just shut the fuck up and play the beat, man.
Good show. This is way more up my alley. Now I have some beef to settle. I've heard that Western Africa, although producing 30% of the world's cocoa, is still being exploited to this day.
It's time to get the musket.
Cheerio!
I was chilling on my phone
when I saw some shit on my timeline I just can't condone.
No, good sir.
It sort of got me off my zone.
A child slavery case?
The niggas bad to the bone.
The queen.
Cocoa companies, there's just too much to say. They rub me the wrong way. Slavery in broad day. Blasphemy. I expected this to just be a jest, not a company PR move of public chess. Tally-ho.
Imperialism.
God. It's always up to something. And when the beat starts bumping, I must start fisty cupping. Diana. Message to the public. It's time we expose these frauds. Just like Timmy Turner's Pixies, this is getting fairly odd. I wish for peace, but nigga, I can't disdain. Child lives are on the line. I just simply can't refrain. On God. To the public, nigga, this is what I say. Africa is bleeding cocoa. Let's alleviate the pain. In the good Lord's name.
Just an update on the cocoa lawsuit case. Basically, we lost it. Yeah, those child workers will never ever get to see any compensation for their work. Instead of instilling the blame on the companies, they instilled the blame on the traffickers. Specifically, the traffickers were the ones that were at fault, when this is in fact a structural flaw of imperialism and exploitation that's been going on for hundreds of years. And I can't stress this enough. When we look at it on a case-by-case basis, we pretty much refute the reality of the situation. There's a system of exploitation going on right now in the Ivory Coast that I cannot stress enough is so endangering to thousands and thousands of child workers, adult workers too. So please keep the same energy. Even though we lost the case, please hold the cocoa companies accountable. Thank you. Thank you guys for watching till the end of this video. I took a 3-week break from this, more like a month. Why? It was because I fell into a little depression and I felt a little creatively stifled by the content I was making. The 10-minute videos are cool and all, but I like putting a concise story together. The 10-minute videos are cool and all, but I like delving into my topics with nuances. The 10-minute videos are cool and all, but I like diving into my topics' nuances. If you notice, this video was way longer than the 10-minute format I usually do on my channel. I'm trying new things with my content and venturing into more creative waters. You'll see it over the course of the next 2 months, and I plan on releasing consistently this time, and I promise. It's flamingo season. Look at him. It's flamingo season. Sharing, liking, and commenting. Sharing, liking, and commenting helps my channel a ton. So I appreciate it if you shared, liked, and commented so much. I have a Patreon if you want to monetarily support me, but I'm also on ad revenue now, so a subscription is way more than enough. I plan on making long format videos like this alongside my shorter former content, although 10 minutes is kind of way too short for a script. I'm realizing I want to try to push it to like 20-30 minutes at the least. I'm gonna be diversifying my content, doing collabs, and just all that fun stuff that makes being a YouTuber the funnest job in the world. I love YouTube. Look at me. This is my part-time job. How do you feel about that? I thank you so much for being with me on this journey. 1 month and we're at the 7K mark. Well, actually, editor's note, we're at 9K. That was a crazy leap from 7K. Like last month. That's crazy. The growth has been insane. You guys have been insane. And I just love y'all so much. I can't say it enough. All my socials are down below. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter. Interact with me. I like interacting with people because I talk. I'm a talker. I can speak